We are very privileged to have here with us Professor Janet Carsten, Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She is a renowned scholar in the area of kinship studies and gender and personhood. She has published widely, and some of her important works include Cultures of Relatedness, New Approaches to the Study of Kinship, and also After Kinship. Professor Carsten's research has focused mainly on Malaysia and Britain. And today we would be talking a little bit about sort of kinship and the nuclear family. So, Professor Carsten, I want to draw your attention to one of the kind of ongoing debates that are going on in Sri Lanka about dysfunctional families. There's been quite a lot of discussion about preventing poor migrant women who migrate to the Middle East for domestic work to try to prevent them from going. And if they need to go, there's a government circular that came out, I think, last year, stipulating that a family background report needs to be filled, which requires the woman migrating to get the permission of her husband to migrate, as well as have a female caregiver consent to looking after her children. And this kind of moral panic about the nuclear family, or the breaking down of the nuclear family, is not unique to Sri Lanka, I think. There is general panic in other parts of the world that there's something going on. And I was wondering, one of the things that really struck me was the kind of complete disregard for extended kinship networks that women have always relied on to bring up children, for example. And whether you had any thoughts about why there is this moral panic and this disregard for kinship.
Very interesting question. And of course, I'm not at all an expert on Sri Lanka, so forgive me if I say something that's not really relevant or appropriate. But I think the family everywhere around the world is a tremendous arena for moral panic, whether it's about abusive relations, about teenage sexuality, about, there's so many wonderful areas to get into a panic about. Perhaps it's conducive to that. But one thing that I think is really important here is the way that the idea of the nuclear family is also a symbol, I think, in many cultures around the world today, of what it means to be modern. So the idea that you have a nuclear family, that the nuclear family is the most significant arena for socializing children, is really important in being somehow modern. And so the idea equally that, in fact, probably in all cultures, there have always been many people involved in bringing up a child. There's Carol Stack's work on black families in the United States. Wherever you look, there have been, women have gone to other women, particularly, whether it's their sisters or their mothers, as first resorts for help in looking after. But somehow this is kind of plays into a discourse about modernity where those kind of relations, as you call them, extended family, are seen as somehow backward. And that's certainly the case in Malaysia, where the idea of the extended family, as it's called, is seen as somehow backward. And so we've all got to be modern and nuclear, and therefore it's really important to have the mother involved as the principal caregiver in bringing up a child. And of course, families are themselves, as we know, means of reproducing hierarchy and of surveillance of the proper behavior, but they are also the subjects of it by the state in all sorts of ways. But that's a kind of very tense boundary line, because too much intrusive surveillance somehow implies that an intrusion into the proper privacy of the family, and I use that word in quotes, whereas too little can imply neglect or somehow the allowance of relations that are not proper or not proper to the reproduction of wider society. So, I mean, that raises all sorts of questions. I mean, the other area that I know about where women's migration and care for their children has been a subject of intense interest among anthropologists is the Philippines, where women very often, again, leave their children in the care of other, quite often mothers or sisters, in fact. But as far as I know, it hasn't resulted in the kind of state measures that you're saying have appeared in Sri Lanka. So that's quite interesting. But I mean, as an academic anthropologist interested in kinship, I would want to investigate what those relations involve, and particularly between the wider family members and the children that are being looked after, because it's very possible that has historically been important in the past in any case, because women went out to work. I mean, domestic workers also have children, even if they're locally employed. And so who's looking after the children then? And one would want to look at the historical trajectories involved there.
Okay, thank you. I was trying to sort of think about, at the same time, this sort of emphasis on the nuclear family that has gone sort of in tandem with sort of the move within the academy and beyond, when it comes to gay and lesbian kinship, it has kind of forced us to sort of rethink, what is kinship and reconsider how we think about how we are related to each other. So, and at the same time, feminist scholars like yourself have sort of critiqued the way in which, the heteronormative family continues to dominate and that you need to kind of dismantle it. But then an interesting contradiction is the way in which sort of the gay and lesbian community has fought for the right to be legally married and have children and sort of reproduce the nuclear family. So it seems to me in some ways that even as we speak about the nuclear family as something that is a structure that we need to kind of get rid of, that it continues to persist. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, it is indeed a really interesting contradiction, apparent contradiction. And I suppose we need to take apart the different meanings of the family and what it does for the people that we study. So academically, one of the interesting things about gay and lesbian kinship in the first place, I think, for anthropologists was that they were very obvious means to look at the denaturalization of kinship and of biological relations that feminist anthropologists had raised. So, there's the question of denaturalization of gender, but also the question that became increasingly important around the end of the 20th century was the possibility of reproduction. So, study of what were then called new reproductive technologies and the ways these might be taken up by gay and lesbian partners and the possibilities of having children, and then, what does that do to ideas about substance, ideas about reproduction, and so on. So that's kind of one strand in that. But another strand, as you correctly have pointed out, is to do with relations with the state and with the recognition of relations. And that's, I think, a quite different area in a way, because it gets into areas about rights discourses and the legitimation of relations by the state, which, of course, is a really important part of the interface between kinship and family, that marriage is legitimated by the state. And the same questions have arisen. And there's a nice piece actually by Judith Butler on the contradictoriness of the idea that gay or lesbian partners should require or wish to have their relations legitimated by a state in which historically they've not had that kind of investment. So what they were doing was always seen as alternative, or through the 20th century was somehow in opposition to the state. So how come now you get this quest for normativity or legitimation, or if that's what it is? I suspect there's some good fieldwork to be done about what it means to be married for gay and lesbian partners in particular places at particular historical moments, and that we shouldn't necessarily assume that we know the answer to that question without looking at it ethnographically, because it may be that the kinds of legitimation are not exactly the same that are important. And it may be, well, one thing is financial security, of course, and the idea that you get pension rights or inheritance rights. So there's that kind of question that it raises. Another thing is legitimation to whom and for whom. So is it partly about legitimation towards one's family, in fact, one's family of birth, which raises quite interesting questions about the relationship between state and family, in fact, that somehow the state also is necessary to help legitimate those relations within the family circle, that's somehow seen as a positive thing. I don't know, but these are interesting topics for research, I think. But what they really put into question are two things. One is, as I've said, naturalization questions, and the other is relations between family and the state. So they seem to highlight particular kinds of questions, which then, which may be more normative relations between men and women don't in the same way.
So just to kind of double back on, going back into sort of the question about the state and it's sort of in some ways regulating the family in particular ways, but at the same time the family in itself reproducing certain inequalities. And I thought maybe we could end with sort of a discussion about how the family, or in specifically women, mothers, for example, kind of reproduce inequality within the family. So sort of in South Asian literature, there is this whole discussion about how, in sort of on the one hand, women are making choices about who they get married to, and their own reproductive choices, and they seem to be sort of having more room for maneuver in the family. But at the same time, they're using the kind of education they have received in order to groom their own children, specifically their daughters, to be of a specific class. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts about how sort of women sort of in some way sort of complicit in the reproduction of inequality within the family.
Well, that's a really important area, I think, and family, of course, is, as you say, absolutely a major area for the reproduction of inequality. And one of the curious things about the anthropology of kinship has always been the tendency of anthropologists to see it through a sort of positive lens, that kinship relations are inherently good and positive, when we know very well from the research that we do that this is complete nonsense, that even relationships that one might want to say are basically positive often have a kind of darker side or more negative edge. And families, of course, do some terrible things to each other precisely in the name of kinship. The family honour debates one area of that. And women are as complicit in that as men, partly in the way they bring up their sons and their daughters, not just daughters, because I think perhaps equally important is what they do with their sons. Although it's probably true that in many parts of the world, not in all, for certain classes of people, there is more choice for women than there was. Nevertheless, I mean, I think there's very interesting work to do, probably around marriage exactly, to do with what in fact, when you give people more choice, apparently, what in fact are the practices that come out of that, and are they actually pretty similar to what was happening before? And if so, why? You know, what does the language, the idiom of choice give to people, and what are the practices that go alongside that idiom, and does it really imply, do we really know that a priori? And I suspect that we don't really, but certainly I would suspect that what women do with their daughters and their sons is very, very important part of that.
Thank you. And maybe we'll end with last question about sort of something that you talked about, and also one of the key areas of research that you've been involved in, which is the idea of personhood. And I wondered whether gender and personhood specifically, whether what you talked about, sort of there's this idea that women have more choice, and has that in some ways changed or the way in which women think about themselves as persons within families, whether there has been any kind of shift there?
I think, I wave the flag for ethnography here, because I think you would need to look, I would be very hesitant about making any global generalizations on that front about whether ideas about personhood have generally shifted. I think you would need to look in particular times, particular places, particular classes, which would be very significant. And I suspect there's quite a lot of variation. Certainly in some parts of the world, discourses about the self are very, very important. But one of the reasons that kinship is interesting to me is that it's precisely a realm where discourses about the self rub up against something that we apparently take for granted, which is the idea of the family as a realm where people do things for each other, where they cooperate, where they share, where they care for each other. And we know that those are all gendered ideas as well. So all of those things impinge very much on personhood, and they can't be studied kind of in the abstract, but also in the context of gender relations, I think.